Food. It's what fuels us, gives us energy, heals us, brings us happiness, and is a backbone of the world economy. Without it, there would be no life on Earth. Most people know that there are certain foods deemed healthy and unhealthy. What most people don't know is why those foods are deemed that way, and the specific benefits and disadvantages of these foods. In this video, we're going to look at how someone with a predisposition to the Lynch syndrome gene mutation should eat in their daily life. Let's go over a brief overview of what Lynch syndrome actually is. Our body is made up of cells, and those cells are made up of DNA, which has the genetic code to make up every one of our traits. Just like code in computer software, there are bugs or mutations. Luckily, our body has designed a mechanism to detect these mutations and fix them. However, people with Lynch syndrome have deficient repair systems causing these mutations to remain unfixed. This means that cell division genes can accidentally get turned on when they're not supposed to and rapidly divide without being signaled to stop. Colorectal and stomach cancer are the main consequences of Lynch syndrome, as well as endometrial and ovarian cancer in women. People with Lynch syndrome have an 80% increase in lifetime risk of getting these cancers. So obviously, people want to avoid getting cancer. And while there are many drugs out there for treating cancer that are getting better and better every year, prevention is the best method. One of the ways this can be done is through diet and lifestyle choices. Lynch syndrome has not been as thoroughly researched as other genetic predispositions because it is hard to study as well as differentiate other disorders from Lynch. Because of this, there isn't that much data on how diet can be used in a preventative manner specifically against Lynch syndrome. There are many different factors that vary from patient to patient, including their own personal nutritional needs. There is a lot more potential research to be done as gene therapy technology advances. However, there are many studies that show correlations between certain diets and lowered accounts of colorectal cancer. From what we already know about colorectal cancer, we know what lifestyle choices can be beneficial. Some positive choices to be made include regular exercise, increased consumption of dietary fiber from foods such as fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, as well as other antioxidants and vitamins. Some of the negative choices to be made include smoking, high consumption of meat, specifically red meat and processed meat, eating refined sugars, saturated fats, and excessive alcohol consumption. Let's look more specifically at why these choices have the effect they do. We've discussed how to lead a life that is preventative against cancer, but why is that? Let's start by talking about the Western diet. The Western diet is usually what the American diet is referenced as, and usually refers to a diet heavy in red meat, trans fats, fast food, refined grains, and high sugar intake. This diet can cause lots of health problems, with cancer being one of the most severe, specifically colorectal cancer. The reason for this is because typically this diet leads to an increase in body fat percentage and can eventually lead to obesity. When someone is obese, lots of normal bodily functions can become abnormal. This can include hindrances to insulin production, estrogen and testosterone production, as well as insulin growth factor regulation. When these are abnormally regulated, cells can become mutated and divide when they're not supposed to, causing cancer to form. The main fix for this is to deviate from the Western diet and include foods in your diets that are anti-inflammatory and cancer-preventing, such as vegetables, whole grains, legumes, fruits, fish, and some white meats. These are going to greatly minimize obesity from becoming an issue, and in turn reduce the carcinogenic effects on the body. Within the Western diet, there are lots of carcinogenic foods, but one of them has been studied thoroughly in relation to the colorectal cancer, and that is red meat consumption. Studies have shown that colorectal cancer is actually one of the main types of cancers that is caused through excessive consumption of red meat. There are many different reasons as to why red meat consumption can be carcinogenic, the first of which we discussed earlier, and that is that there's a large amount of saturated fat in red meat, and when consumed, there is a sharp increase in body fat. In turn, this causes an increase in insulin resistance, which can cause higher production of bile acids. These bile acids that come from the stomach in high amounts are very carcinogenic. Another carcinogenic factor comes from before any actual consumption is done. When cooking red meat, heterocyclic aromatic amines are released, In small amounts, they're relatively harmless, but if exposed consistently over a long period of time, they can become carcinogenic and a very dangerous risk factor. All these factors are essentially mutating our genes that cause these abnormalities. So, to bring it back to Lynch syndrome, when there's a large increase in gene mutations due to consumption of red meat, there's a higher chance of developing cancer because Lynch syndrome patients don't have the means of properly fixing these mutations. To give some perspective on the reality of Lynch syndrome, I'm going to share a little bit of my family history. My paternal grandfather died from lung cancer a few years ago, even though he is one of the healthiest individuals I've ever known. He had both stomach and colon cancer a few years prior, and both his stomach and majority of his colon were surgically removed to get rid of the cancer. Additionally, both of my dad's sisters have had colon cancer at some point in their lives. Our family was tested for the Lynch syndrome mutation, and we found that my grandfather and every single one of his kids all tested positive for a variation of it, including my own dad. This means that there is a 50% chance that my brothers and I could all have Lynch syndrome as well. Because of this, our family gets yearly screenings for colon and stomach cancer starting at age 20, as well as endometrial and ovarian for women. This entails going in for a colonoscopy as well as an endoscopy to where they are checked for polyps, cancerous or benign. This is the best way of preventing cancer, aside from making healthy lifestyle choices. Our family has been used for some research as well because of how little is known about Lynch syndrome, and it has inspired me and many of my family members to think twice about what we eat and how we live our lives. There's a lot one can do to prevent cancer. As we learn more about it, we're also learning the best way to prevent it through many different means, especially nutrition. Reducing our intakes of processed and red meats, as well as deviating from the Western diet in general, as well as including more healthful foods such as fibrous vegetables and fruits, whole grains and legumes, is the best way of preventing cancer from forming in the first place, especially in those with Lynch syndrome. There's still lots of research to be done about Lynch syndrome, and the more we learn, the better we will be at detecting it and preventing cancer from forming.